The iManager virtual conference on mathematics, dynamics of prediction models, constraints and optimization, September 15th, 2020. Modeling social problems and unrest in socio-political ecology under the subtopic, visualizing the historic impact of systemic cycles of manifested oppression. In this keynote content, I'm going to cover 4 different areas. Number 1, the reality. We're going to begin with looking at where we are now in deference to the worldwide global pandemic, which we more commonly know now as COVID-19. Secondly, we're going to look at models based upon the previous research methodology that I have been privileged to provide. I thank you for iManager for providing the opportunity to share these articles and this information with our research and academic community. And through this, we're going to talk about a research methodology that allows for the construction of models that display the overall structure and infrastructure of our identified problem. Next, we're going to move to the history and using my country of origin, the United States of America, as a microcosm of a greater macrocosm of what's going on globally. We are going to provide that as an example, and we're going to model the problem and illustrate it in depth. And then we will move to a conclusion, which is a summary of the previous points, including topic key points and solutions. My introduction, visualizing the historic impact of systemic cycles of manifested oppression. First of all, I would like to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to hear this presentation. The purpose of this keynote is to provide information under the universal title of Modeling Social Problems and Unrest, Socio-Political Ecology, to address the current problems that we are facing as a global society. I bring you greetings from North Carolina Central University. It's the crack of the morning here. As you must or probably do know and have seen through much of what's going on, we have some interesting problems going with wildfires on our West Coast, with a global pandemic locking us down in various places where we've had to operate virtually. We're making decisions now within our schooling in terms of where we're going to go if we have to close more universities. So it's a very serious time here globally, but especially in the United States. But I thank you for taking the time out to hear this presentation. The reality. A simple query. Where are we now? We're experiencing a global pandemic of epic proportions because of COVID-19. We have a reality in which we have stay-at-home strategies where we're having to do things that we haven't had to do before because of the lack of freedom of movement and different things that are going on. Our reality is covered an unrest. We're seeing systemic inequity brought about by oppression in which we're having conflicts rising up in different parts of society. Excuse me. This is a pandemic, as we've said earlier, of epic proportions, tragic circumstance leading to massive civil unrest. Why is that? We have protests, political resistance, economic loss, and social instability. We have to socially distance 2 meters, the metric system in the imperial system, just above 6 feet or about 7 feet. We're having to do things differently. Our reaction. Our pandemic has caused us to have to make some systemic decisions governmentally. Stay-at-home orders to the public because of COVID-19. New changes in social life, including but not limited to social distancing, face coverings, and limited travel. We have to, and have been told, we have to disinfect and better hygiene via hand washing and cleansing. We have to spray disinfectants around to make certain that the infection does not increase. We have to adopt our facial masks, as we saw in China and different places throughout the world, so the infection does not spread further. We have to contain ourselves. But all of this has provided a background and backbone to civil unrest. What are our public reactions? We're experiencing, not since the massive, after World War I pandemic that was called, in some cases, the Spanish flu and other names, global infection, a massive loss of life. We are unable, as members of the clergy, to do the normal things that are necessary for our funeral service because we cannot congregate en masse. We're seeing more loss of life directly due to viral infections. And this has led to the uncovering and pressure upon society, which has caused more civil and social unrest. Encounters with the law enforcement has led to a loss of life, particularly if we observe very closely with people of color. In summary, there is a justifiable rising tide that has uncovered unjust inequities throughout society. The overriding outcome has been one of repeated tragedy, so much so that political reaction has led to direct confrontation globally with the resulting protests. When the irresistible force of massive social unrest meets with the immovable object of leadership resistance, the result is conflict. As physics states, when an irresistible object meets an immovable object meets with an irresistible force, boom, you have an explosion. And so it's now possible via research to express and visualize the historic impact of systemic cycles of manifested oppression. People do not protest without a reason. I'll say it again. People do not protest without a reason. COVID-19 has uncovered something. What's really going on? Why are people protesting? Particularly that look like us, particularly people of color. What is really going on? We found that COVID is far more than just a physical disease. It is a social disease as well as a psychosocial disease. It is mired in historic injustices and manifested in traumatic outcomes. COVID ramifications. We know about the physical, we see that, we've experienced that. But what about the social and psychosocial? How can we use our expertise in mathematical modeling to allow a representation of the social and psychosocial outcomes of COVID? Is there an expansive model? What are we really dealing with? Problem identification. Research allows for inquiry into the nature of the identified problem and its outcomes by an in-depth analysis of the past via a careful study of history. People are protesting for a reason. An investigation of history provides a detailed context and a logical rationale of why things are currently the way they are. Another query. So what did we learn? What has come out of this? Why are people actively protesting? What's really going on? As we take a look at our globe, and we're looking in particular at microcosms here and there and everywhere throughout the world, what's really going on? What have we learned? I posit and submit to you what the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us and revealed as a result of what has been witnessed. Global social unrest during the COVID pandemic has uncovered widespread inequity that is strengthened by a massive model of the ongoing institution of racism. And so we've talked about where we are right now. We've talked about the reality. We all are experiencing that depending upon where we live. We're all seeing the social unrest and the things that are going on. We've seen the conflict. For those who are not present in the conflict, it's a little different in trying to associate or disassociate or make relevant what's actually going on. So we move to phase 2 of our topic during this keynote, and it is models. Under our subtopic, visualizing the historic impact of systemic cycles of manifested oppression. Another query: what is the background? Where are you coming from as you talk about this identification of where we are right now? So I want to talk a little bit about the research that has brought me to this point, and of the power of mathematics to model, as was given in the very first brilliant keynote, and looking at the dynamics of what's going on. And so with the relationship we've had with our managers, it's allowed us to do fundamental and incremental and explosive exponential research into several different areas. Starting in 2012, when looking at various statistical models and looking at different ways to analyze data, we were given the opportunity to publish Trichotomy Squared, a novel mixed methods test and research procedure designed to analyze, transform, and compare qualitative and quantitative data. And that was the foundation of beginning to look at what we're going to talk about in a little bit, which is the mathematics of trichotomy and how that applies to life in general. Next, we had in 2013, algorithmic triangulation metrics, which began to form a cyclical model that we began to see present in nature as well as socio-political structures. Next, we had trial statistics, where we began to develop a field in looking at this model, which was coming up over and over again. In 2017, we began to look at the science behind this model, looking at other sciences. Once again, published in our Journal of Mathematics for my manager. And ultimately, the framework in 2017 that will formulate the foundation of this particular address, which is TEM, a concentrated TEM with the brackets, triangular equation modeling. And you will see that come up again and again and again, and how these cyclical models of trichotomy are repeated within themselves, and as they explode out, they give us a framework to look at the actual problem we're dealing with. The brilliance of mathematics is that it uses the principle of parsimony. We're able to say a lot with very, very little. And in that a lot of what we're saying, it allows us, beyond those who are not mathematicians, to gather a better understanding of our approach and what we are saying in the most simplistic ways. That's the beauty of seeing patterns and the beauty of mathematics. In 2017, we continued this thought once again in iManager's Journal of Mathematics, looking at iterative and recursive trichotomous relations. So this trichotomy kept coming up. We kept seeing it subatomic levels. We kept seeing it in society. In 2018, we began to look at it in terms of e-learning with trial engineering in the Journal of Mathematics, and ultimately to looking at instrumentations to study this in 2020. So what is our foundation? What are we talking about? What is the mathematical law of trichotomy? In terms of looking at mathematics, our early researchers began to see that we could expand a dichotomy. You know, of course, a dichotomy, positive, negative, black, white, hot, cold. They began to see the neutral. And this really expounded when Apostle began to work on his treatise on calculus, looking at early work of Leibniz and Newton, and putting all of this together. And basically what we found was that, like an atom, we have a positive, a negative, and a neutral. So we have a general preposition or idea we posit. We have the antithesis of that, and then we have a lacking of neither. And so we refer to that as the mathematical law of trichotomy. Apostle took that and he broke it down as A is greater than B, as we see A is equal to B, and A is less than B, A is equal to B, and A is greater than B holds. And basically, in a roundabout way, talking about this initial idea, the opposite, and the third neutral. And so we talk about that a bit more in the next slide, Sensigent did a excellent job of talking about that in 2012. And so that became our foundation, this notion mathematically of this trichotomy of three, coming up again and again and again. And so when we look at this three, we're able to mathematically produce that in Cartesian coordinates as an upright right triangular model that we refer as TEM, or triangular equation model. So we have A, B, C, return to A. What we found in the research was it's very cyclical. We go from A to B, B to C, and then C returns to A. And we found that repeating again and again in nature. But interestingly enough, when we began to look at our social political structure. So another query, well, what is the problem? We identified what we're experiencing now with COVID. We posit to you that we have a global social problem, and that is racism. Racism is a savage fire that is burning up our world. COVID has unveiled a greater aspect in that this is not a localized phenomenon. It is global. So then we have to look carefully at racism. So what is it? How do we define it? Are those there who have defined it? And how is racism different than prejudice? The ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, defines racism as follows. Racism is the marginalization and or oppression of people of color based on socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges Caucasians or white people. Prejudice. Prejudice is defined by psychology as an unjustified or incorrect attitude, usually negative, towards an individual based solely on the individual's membership of a social group. The important thing to recognize here is that racism is an institution. It is based on power used to enforce negative economic, political, and social outcomes, whereas prejudice is basically preferential bias based on culture, preference, and attitude. Often we mistake prejudice for racism and do not name what we see as if someone has a problem with someone because of where they're from or socioeconomic status as prejudice. To have racism, you must have social, political, economic power. Historically, you must have that. That allows you to marginalize people. Without that, it is simple prejudice. Now, don't make the mistake that racism and prejudice are interdependent. They are independent. They are interdependent. Systemic prejudice is an outcome of racism. But racism has problematic power as it is able and enabled by the economic and power structures to marginalize people with negative consequences. And we will look at that through our TEM model. The problem, using concentrated triangular equation modeling of racism. Defining the societal infirmity of COVID through the lens of racism, which has massive impact. The overall effects of racism is massive and can specifically be identified as the core of COVID as a social and psychosocial disease that has affected the entire global community. Racism has three trichotomous overarching effects. Number one, it is systemic. Number two, it is structural. And number three, it is seismic. The three S's: systemic, structural, and seismic. The three effects are relationally expressed through our triangular equation modeling and how they have subsumed and sit on top of the entire globe. Systemic leading to structural racism, leading to seismic racism, back to systemic racism, and the cycle repeats itself over and over again. So let's break that down. Number one, systemic racism. That's racism as a social and psychosocial disease is a part of a much larger set of things working together as parts. That's the definition of systemics or systems. As parts of a mechanism or interconnected network that directly impacts the natural diversity of the world. We're all diverse. We see different colors of flowers. You have a variety of different types of trees and plants. But systemic racism systemizes social and psychosocially a disease which marginalizes people and empowers others, often brutally. Number two, structural racism. Racism as a social and psychosocial disease, as an oppressive, predefined arrangement of relations between the parts and elements of a planned prejudice that has massive economic, political, and social impact. So it's systemic, it's a system, but it has a structure. The system cannot work without the structure. With the structure in place, through political and social economic power, you are able to marginalize. Lastly, seismic racism, and this is most heinous. Racism as a social and psychosocial disease has impact of enormous and epic proportions and effects that cannot be escaped, and victimizes all persons that are deemed outside of its predefined parameters. Seismic, we think of our seismic scale in earthquake. There's nowhere you can run and hide from it unless you can get up in the air. But if you're on the ground, when the earthquake happens, there's nowhere you can go. And so when we look at these three trichotomously together through our TEM model, they create a cyclical whole. Seismic plus structural, systemic, or systemic plus structural plus seismic as overarching effects that are interrelated cyclically and continually plague our global society. So we are able now to take the problem of COVID as an acronym, not necessarily the physical coronavirus, and we are now able to call it COVID, cyclical oppression and victimization that impacts diversity. Cyclical oppression and victimization that impacts diversity. Cyclical oppression and victimization that impacts diversity. So now we have, in a nutshell, we've talked about our research, we've talked about our model. Now we're going to drill deep and we're going to look at some history. Once again, visualizing the historic impact of systemic cycles of manifested oppression as COVID as a psychosocial and social disease, which is cyclical oppression, victimizing, and having impact on diversity. How did this start? Good question. So we've identified it as cyclical oppression and victimization that impacts diversity and the incivility that comes in, because what COVID-19 has done is once the pressure and external pressure is on the system, a relating pressure expansively presses out. And so people under pressure and dealing with things, it's going to bring about unease. And that unease is going to magnify problems. And that's going to lead with conflict, particularly if the system is already oppressive. The things that you normally might not see, if you're not in that community or in that context, will manifest itself because there's resistance. The incivility due to the pressures caused by historic injustice and social unrest have manifested globally. That's our social crisis. The United States as a representative example. So we're now going to use the US and we're going to start talking about the history to explain and use our TEM to demonstrate and show how these models have occurred. A closer look at the US will provide a microcosm of COVID as cyclical oppression and victimization that impacts diversity model through the lens using TEM to identify problematic outcome and effect areas. So again, we're going to target the US out of our global community, and we're going to take at the cyclical oppression and victimization that impacts diversity by looking at a timeline in the history and targeted dates. So one thing we know about a virus is that it will mutate over time. If it's not actively dealt with, and if it does not, is not removed basically out of the genomic structure of humanity or whatever the organism it is that is infecting, as a survivability modality, it will mutate. So you can stop it in ways here, but if it's not completely eradicated, it will mutate into something else. And that's going to play out over targeted dates that we will see using TEM, triangular equation modeling, using the US as an example. So this notion in terms of US history was first defined by Dr. Otis Moss III, the pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ here in the United States. He specifically identified COVID as the virus and racism as the disease from the first Africans who were brought to the US as chattel slaves. So this was not traditional slavery. This was slaves as property. And it allowed those who were above them and those who were bringing them here to use forms of brutality and torture that changed the mindset. And so the mindset of both the person in captivity and the mindset of the person who's captive over them shift. You have to take on a different mindset to brutalize something. And you have to take on a different mindset to be continually oppressed and to stay under that brutality without active resistance. The internal and externally trichotomous models of the negative outcomes of discrimination on the three learning domains. So we talked about there has to be a change in the person who's doing this and a change in the person who's affected. We know our three learning domains as cognitive, thought, affective, our emotions, and then psychomotor, our actual actions. So in our head mentally, and our emotions and our feelings, our heart, and in our hands or our body, the things that we actually do. But they become trichotomously negative when you're going about this thing as a result of this social and psychosocial disease of COVID. And so our model mutates into a more organism-looking structure, still the same virus. Our negative cognitive outcome or negative thoughts become prejudice. In our affective domain, in our heart, it becomes hatred. And then what we do in our actions becomes brutality. And this is overall discrimination under the disease of racism from the virus of COVID as a psychosocial and social disease, cyclically oppressing victimization of those who have diversity. So what does this look like in our TEM? We have our definition, which is cognitive, that's our domain. It is in the area of mentality or thoughts. We use our more graphical model of the COVID virus there, and the more organic virus to actually talk about how it manifests itself. So this is a trichotomy within a trichotomy. Of course, our position, our center is the globe, and the lens is the United States we're talking about right now. And so we have negative thoughts as prejudice, into the heart as hatred. You can't brutalize something that you don't hate. If you love it, you're not going to brutalize it. You're not going to do these things to it. But if you can work out the hatred, if the hatred it comes from this social and psychosocial disease, then you're going to be brutal to it. And tragedy, therefore, ensues. So how did this go about? How did this happen? How did this manifest? So we're now going to, again, looking at US, and particularly US history, with COVID as a social and psychosocial disease, with manifested racism as a disease, looking at these three negative cognition, negative affective, and negative psychomotor areas in our TEM model as trichotomous negative outcomes of oppression. And we're going to look at these in three trichotomous dates that confirm and emphasize as a microcosm what happened in the US globally. Of course, it's different historically, but the same mechanism, depending on where you live. So we have three dramatic dates: 1619, 1877, and then updating to 2020. So we're going to look at a trichotomous model of the triple negatives we talked about as social and psychosocial COVID under our acronym viruses, deconstructing the pandemic of oppression historically, looking at these three targeted dates in the US: COVID 1619, COVID 1877, and COVID 2020. And we're going to look at what happened socially and politically during these times that justifies our acronym of cyclical oppression and victimization that impacts diversity. So we've got to develop a problem methodology model looking at COVID, again, using our TEMs, our triangular equation modeling. So there's our dates: 1619 again, 1877, and 2020. Again, the virus mutates for time. And what happens during these times in the United States? Prejudice, racism, and ignorance. So now we're going to deconstruct this pandemic of oppression by identifying these things, particularly through the lens of societal infirmities, as COVID's racism from these three empowerment areas. COVID, now we're going to call them COVID 1619, COVID 1877, and COVID 2020. Defining societal infirmity of COVID throughout the US historic areas. The identification of racism as a public health issue that causes death, poverty, marginalization, lack of access to resources, and negative quality of life as systemized, structural, and seismic oppression. The models that follow demonstrate the initially identified trichotomous triple negatives. They are further identified as debilitating psychosocial viruses and the trichotomous COVID model, using our acronym, viruses as three systemic periods, again, 1619, 1877, and 2020, that shows and greatly demonstrate the impact and empower disease of racism in the US. So we're going to properly define and identify the ailment looking at these dates. What happened with COVID 1619? Cyclical oppression and victimization that impacts diversity in 1619. Well, in 1619, that was when those Africans as slaves, as chattel slaves, were first brought to the US as chattel slaves. And it caused three trichotomous symptoms: captivity, cyclically to brutality, cyclically to oppression. The trichotomous results were limitation, poverty, and pejorative self-worth, declaring that you're less than human internally, internalized oppression. So the person under the externalized oppression begins to internalize that oppression. They declare themselves in a negative light, and that is pejorative self-worth. And then lastly, the trichotomous outcomes as hatred, bigotry, and marginalization. So because of this institution of chattel slavery that started in 1619, we have this cyclical cycle of oppression socially, politically, and economically that will have long-standing ramifications, because this virus, as initially as social and psychosocial disease, will mutate over time. 258 years later, we move from the initial persons brought here as COVID 1619 to COVID 1877. The virus mutates. As we said, if you don't get rid of it, it's going to mutate and become something stronger or something. It's going to change itself. So the parameters you use, the inoculations that you use to take care of it as it was then, it mutates to something else, so it continues to attack you. What happened? In 1877, because now after the Civil War, which ended in 1865, there's no longer slavery as it was stated in the United States. Seems that everybody is free. But the United States Supreme Court, that's our highest court in the land, enacted the heinous, what they called Jim Crow laws. Separate but unequal. And so we went to having water fountains that said white and water fountains that said the derogatory color. You could not sit together. You could not eat together. You were placed in marginalized communities away from common society. And there was not equity. What are our trichotomous results of this? Well, in 1877, we had as a trichotomous symptom, systemic prejudice, lack of protection from sustained violence and murder, and a denial of opportunities based off of skin color. Our trichotomous results: limited access to resources, systemic destruction of communities that will interplay as this virus will further mutate, equity. Our trichotomous outcomes: robbery of restitution. So there was restitution that was supposed to take place, typically known in the US as what we call then 40 acres and a mule, that never manifested itself. In other cases of where the United States has marginalized people of ethnicity or color, such as the internment of Japanese US citizens during World War II, economic reparations were restored, but it never happened for African Americans. Just this year, one community in the state in which I live, North Carolina, even acknowledged that reparations needed to be imposed. And that imposed an economic downturn that we see as the trichotomous outcomes of, after the robbery of restitution, lack of legal and federal protection, and denial of equitable education resources. And I want to go back to that lack of legal and federal protection. That's going to come up again, because that's going to lead to the systemic process of the destruction and death of Black individuals, particularly males, by the heinous crime of death by hanging and torture, not by society in general, but by those power groups that we're going to talk about in a minute, that deemed if you were walking outside in the wrong place at the wrong time, you would be captured and hung by a tree, possibly sliced up and burned. Again, if you do not deal with the virus, it will mutate. So COVID as a social and psychosocial disease, 143 years later, what happened? Our virus further mutates and transforms into the present day COVID 2020 strand of the virus. What is happening? The virus is unjust racial profiling and outright unjust murder that has led to civil unrest. What happened to George Floyd is not an isolated case. Even as a distinguished African-American professor, noted in academic communities, I can be pulled over, arrested. We had a case here where a world-famous historian, well-known, was that very well-known, I won't name the institution, but an Ivy League institution here in the US, and was pulled because it wasn't believed that he had the home he had on campus, gained national recognition. And so these are incidences, again, that continue this social and psychosocial oppression and victimization that impacts diversity. What are the symptoms? Racial profiling, unequal law enforcement, economic opportunity denial. The results? Massive health disparities. So if you're under this pejorative stress for a long time, it's going to affect you. Now we have generations of it. We're talking about from 1619 all the way down to 2020. You're going to see health disparities. That continual oppression and being under that is going to cause disease. Lack of resources, minimal community quality of life. So you may have some individuals who may, in certain sectors, whether it's in entertainment or athletics or other things, may be able to, because of their economic status or their profile, may be able to get out of the community, but the community of it, in and of itself as a whole continues to struggle. Why? Certain things are put in place that are trichotomous outcomes that don't allow the community to grow. You have the school to prison pipeline, very large area that we talk about here in the US. Ethnic stereotyping and unequitable aversion to opportunity. Now, we talked about this at the grassroots level, but what was going on from the leadership level? So in terms of United States political history as a microcosm of what goes on globally, that provides further evidence and confirms the social and psychosocial ramifications of COVID-1619, COVID-1877, and COVID-2020. Let's take a look at 5 United States presidents who, while in office, provided further evidence that confirms the social and psychosocial ramifications of COVID as a social and psychosocial disease. So in 2020, Stephen James and Eric Friedman wrote an article entitled, "U.S. Presidents Have a Long History of Condescension, Indifference, and Outright Racism Towards Black Americans." And they start off by stating this: Americans are not better informed about the role of presidential leadership. I highlight in bold, and lack of leadership on racial issues. They may have heard that 5 of the first 7 presidents owned slaves, and they know or think they do that Abraham Lincoln, quote unquote, freed the slaves. But even those tidbits of fact are incomplete. Several other presidents, including Ulysses S. Grant, yes, a Union general, and the one who ended the Civil War in 1865, owned slaves. And Lincoln, well known as he is, whose Emancipation Proclamation was more symbolic than practically effective, hated slavery, but never considered Black Americans equal to white Americans. An honest assessment of American presidential leadership on race reveals a handful of courageous actions, but an abundance of racist behavior, even by those remembered as equal rights supporters. Well, let's take a look. We have Rutherford Hayes, United States president from 1877 to 1881, claimed to be a friend of African-American rights. At his inauguration, he said, "A true self-government must be, quote unquote, a government which guards the interests of both races carefully and equally." That's what he said publicly. But he cut a shady deal to win the presidency in the 1876 election. In that deal, he agreed to withdraw federal troops from southern states where they had been protecting Black Americans from the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, a very well-known proactive organization dedicated to racism and white supremacist depredations. They're well known for lynching Black Americans. Over the next 2 decades, Southern whites drove virtually all Black American elected officials from office, often by fraud, sometimes at gunpoint, and about 1,500 Southern Black Americans were murdered via lynching. Another president, William McKinley, United States president from, 1897 to 1901, delivered an inaugural address extolling equal rights and declared, "Lynchings must not be tolerated." However, he remained silent when in my state, here in North Carolina, in Wilmington, North Carolina, staged an 1898 coup that ousted all Black elected officials and killed at least 60 Black Americans. His lack of response to those lynchings prompted a Black-owned newspaper to observe the Negroes, a derogatory term for African Americans at that time, of this country turned with impatience, disappointment, and disgust for Mr. McKinley's fence-straddling and shilly-shallying discussion of the lynch law. So as a community, we were trying to get rid of lynching and get protection for people. This was not a microcosm. What happened in Wilmington also happened in Gap Streets in Oklahoma. Literally, planes were bombed in that bombed that community, set fire to it, and killed those persons in that community. There was a famous film here called Smallwood. The same thing happened in Florida. So what happened after World War I is African Americans tended to, because we could not, and because of the Jim Crow laws, try to build their own sustainable communities. And as they began to thrive, the social economic oppression of COVID as racism and anger over the fact that they were thriving caused things like this. And from the highest levels in the land during this time period, these are the things that were going on. Theodore Roosevelt, well known, historical political figure for promoting US naval power. Theodore Roosevelt, president from 1901 to 1909, believed in white superiority while simultaneously navigating educational opportunity regardless of race. But in a letter to a friend, he honestly wrote, "Now, as to the Negroes, I entirely agree with you that as a race and in mass, they are altogether inferior to whites. So this supremacy notion and mindset, which has been pervasive throughout the world culture, is led to this marginalization and destruction of people of color that continues to this day." Our fourth U.S. president example, Woodrow Wilson, president of the United States for 2 terms from 1913 to 1921, promised fair treatment for African Americans in his 1920 campaign. So you see there's a thread here. There's a promise of equality as they're approaching or trying to get in office. But once they're in, let's see what happens. But once elected, he defended his southern states cabinet. So he had cabinet members from these southern states that came through Jim Crow, and Jim Crow still existed at that time, who segregated workers in federal departments that hadn't been initially segregated, writing, it is as far as possible from being a movement against the Negroes, I sincerely believe it to be in their interest. In a testy White House exchange, Wilson chastised the then very well-known William Monroe Trotter, who was an African-American leader and who was looking for equitable treatment of African Americans and all people of color, and other Black American leaders, asserting that segregation is not a humiliation but a benefit and ought to be so regarded by you gentlemen. If your organization goes out and tells colored people, another derogatory term for African Americans at that time, of the country, that it is a humiliation, they will regard it. The only harm that will come will be if you cause them to think it is a humiliation. So the very standing up for rights, even when you were promised them, was seen as a willfulness of going against, because of course, the president is the leader. He is the commander-in-chief of the United States military. So if you are challenging him, you're challenging the governmental authority. Hence, much like we have now, political unrest, but we've got a history from 1619 to 2020 of injustice. Our last example, well-known president from World War II in that time period, before Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, as he's more well-known, United States president for almost 3 terms from 1933 to 1945, was widely admired among African Americans. While his New Deal program did not benefit Black and white Americans equally, Black Americans did receive benefits. But FDR's actions were always guided by the need to again appease Southern segregationists in the South, because that was the stronghold, cotton production, where slavery was really a way of life, and Congress to pass his other agenda items. And his attitude can be condescending, as when he met Black leaders about integrating the military. He advised a gradual approach, particularly with the Navy. Quote, he stated, "We are training a certain number of musicians on board ship, the ship's band, and there is no reason why we shouldn't have a colored," again, derogatory term, "band on some of these ships, because they're darn good at it." And so the ability to fight and defend the Constitution and defend your country and serve was relegated to nothing, because you were seen less than or as nothing by those who were in social and political economic power. So again, in summary, COVID as a social and psychosocial disease, exemplifying racism in the US as a microcosm of what's going on globally. We have to identify COVID and the COVID model as presented here in our TEM of prejudice, racism, and ignorance, as it presents a lack of equality, opportunity, resources, and the life of those who are marginalized minorities. And so what happens is people begin to resist that. Protest happens after people are tired, and generations change. What one generation tolerates, another generation resists, the final generation becomes incivil. And so a generation has raised up that was not under Jim Crow, that does know the history, but does not want to be up under that, that has grown up when they were young with equitable things with their Caucasian counterparts and don't view that as necessarily a good thing when they get older. And so they resist. When the deaths happen and things because of the incivility of trying to maintain an older structure, which was not right in the first place, we begin to see the social unrest. Identifying once again the societal infirmity, viewing racism as a public health issue that causes death, poverty, and an overall marginalization that is broad in scope and narrow in its viewpoint. The models and examples that preceded this presentation clearly display the identified trichotomous triple negatives that were further defined as debilitating COVID, social, and psychosocial viruses. Our conclusion: visualizing the historic impact of systemic cycles of manifested oppression. What's next? Where do we go from here? We have looked at where we are now with COVID-19 as we're attempting to get vaccines and move forward. We have looked at a model mathematically that allows us to look carefully at causations and results and outcomes. So what do we do now? We looked at history and we looked at why we are here. What are we going to do about it? Currently, the entire globe is caught up in a physical, psychosocial, and social pandemic. COVID-19 and COVID, a cyclical oppression and victimization that impacts diversity. We cannot sit back and expect nothing. We have to put aside our differences and come together. It's time to roll up our sleeves and get to work. The solution: an answer to COVID as a social and psychosocial disease with manifested racism as trichotomous negative outcomes. The long-term solution: reconciliation, leadership, training with planned restorative justice. And so I have been working with researchers globally and researchers here and friends and organizations and things like that since we now are under the global pandemic by phone, by Zoom. And we have been talking, members of the clergy, of which I'm a part of also. We have talked about how do we heal? Where do we go forward from this? We know where we are, we know where we've been, we know what they are, but not forgetting that, but looking and learning from that, how do we move forward? And what are some solutions? And so just as TEM can be used to talk about the negatives, we can also talk about the positives. How do we deal with the trichotomous overarching effects of COVID as a social and psychosocial disease, dealing with systemic, structural, and seismic impactful racism? After defining the societal infirmity of COVID through the lens of racism, which has massive global impact, the answer to each of the trichotomous outcomes, after identifying the ailment as a disease of racism and delivering the solution as a treatment or inoculation with the following components to heal from the overarching effects. And these come from not just myself, but the colleagues I've worked with. Healing through dialogue as an answer to systemic racism. We've got to talk about it. We can't, as a mythical example, be like the ostrich and hide our head in the ground. We got to come and talk about what has happened, to heal from the hurt, not to be accusational, though sometimes that in the dialogue that may happen. People have to vent. If you don't allow persons to express, however, what they're going through, that's a part of the healing process. That's a part of the grief process. It's not good to understand racism from the point just of the victim. The victimizer is also destroyed because of this thing. And so to get us back on a level playing field, we've got to come together and we have to have dialogue. And there's a model for that. We're going to talk about that momentarily. Dealing with the structure that's in place that empowers the system. Professional development and training. There was a gentleman by the name of Al Campanis. So we have, you have cricket, well, in the East, we have baseball here. And he was a gentleman, a world famous team known as the Los Angeles Dodgers. And I believe it was if I get my dates right, in the 90s, he came on one of our global networks, news information networks, and he made a very derogatory statement about baseball players who were of color not being able to hold positions in management. And he was very honest in how he thought about that. And as a result of that, it exposed some things in baseball. Well, the National Baseball League couldn't have that. And what they did is they pulled him aside and they put him through professional development and training. And they opened up training that would allow for more persons from any ethnicity, particularly of African Americans, they were the majority in the league at that time, to have opportunities to work in the field. And because they had spent their whole life developing this skill set to become managers and things like that. Now, ownership, that's a whole nother economic structure that's a part of this that has to change as well. But at least things were starting to change. So professional development and training to address the structure is essential. How do we get better in any of our jobs or our careers? We have professional development and training. And we have to do the same thing to deal with the impacts and the outcomes of structural racism. Lastly, the massive outcome, which is seismic racism. Restorative justice with planned economic development. You can't just give reparations. You got to have a plan in so people can thrive, okay? And so we have to go back and deal with those things. We have to deal with things like, here we're talking about things in terms of racial dynamic. What about gender? What about equity? Okay, if we're going to really be real about this thing, we know that several women, brilliant, who are in the professoriate, they don't get equitable pay. That's restorative justice. That is making things equitable. We have to be serious about it. We can't just talk about it, healing through the dialogue. We can't just train. We've got to put some money and then some plans in, and so that we can move forward. That's honesty. Should we do those things? It's like disinfecting, the disinfectants we put out to get rid of COVID-19 now and clean up. We know that negative hygiene, you're going to have disease, you're going to invite infection, flies, rats, cockroaches, whatever. It's not going to be good. So how do we go about doing this? When we talked about healing through dialogue, Paulo Freire has this brilliant conscientização, critical dialogue, to talk about and to begin the process of healing, naming the thing, dealing with it. We have counseling, we have psychologists. I'm calling for all of those and all of our various disciplines to come together to work at healing this thing, because we need all of us. We do better together than we do apart. Professional development and training. You cannot expect someone who's been through a system, you tend to teach as you've been taught. If they've been educated to marginalize a group of people, you got to change that mindset, but you got to train them. And so that goes with law enforcement, that goes with government officials, that goes with people in schooling and training, and then we'll see systems start to change. And of course, we have to be proactive and serious about opportunity, reparations, community development to stop the seismic impact, the earthquake, the tremor of systemic, seismic, structural racism once and for all. And then we increase our global awareness. We don't stop talking about it. Yes, we do put history on the shelf, but we learn from it, because those who do not study their history are doomed to repeat it. So what has occurred before can be so again. And so we have to be proactive about educating the youth about this. Yes, this is what occurred. This is how we handle it. How can you move forward? What are your thoughts and what are your ideas? And everybody has to come to the table. The cleanup may be massive, but we together can do this. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for providing me the opportunity to share with you this presentation, visualizing the historic impact of systemic cycles of manifested oppression.
Thank you, Dr. Osler.